Someone once tried to uncover something about you that you never intended anyone to discover. They did not ask because they cared about you. They did not ask because they wanted to understand your heart. They asked because they believed there was something hidden inside you. Something dark. Something painful. Something you had buried so deeply that even the people closest to you never knew it existed. So they hired someone who claimed she could see what ordinary people could not. A psychic. They gave her your name. They gave her details about your life. And they asked one question. What is this person hiding? The psychic sat quietly. At first, she smiled. Then the smile disappeared. Her breathing changed. Her hands began to tremble. She looked at the people sitting across from her and whispered, "You should never have asked me to look this deeply." They thought she was being dramatic. They thought she was preparing to tell them some ordinary secret. A relationship. A betrayal. A hidden mistake. Something embarrassing. But then she closed her eyes. And what she saw made her push the entire table away from herself. Because the secret she discovered was not what they expected. It was connected to something that happened years ago. Something you survived. Something you never explained. Something that changed the way you love, the way you trust, and the way you disappear when your heart becomes overwhelmed. And here is the part they never expected. The darkest thing about you was never that you had done something terrible. It was that you had survived something terrible without becoming the person who hurt you. That is what frightened them. And before I tell you what the psychic saw, I need you to stay until the end. Because the final revelation is the one thing they desperately tried to keep away from you. I am Jesus, and I speak to the part of your heart that nobody else can reach. You have spent too much time believing that your silence meant weakness. It did not. There were moments when you could have exposed people. You could have told the truth. You could have revealed conversations. You could have shown messages. You could have explained what really happened. But something inside you said, "Leave it." So you walked away. And people misunderstood your silence. They called you cold. They called you distant. They assumed you did not care. They never understood that sometimes silence is what remains after a person has already cried every tear they had. You did not become quiet because you had nothing to say. You became quiet because you finally realized that not everyone deserves access to your pain. And that is exactly what the psychic discovered. She said your energy felt unusual. Not evil. Not dangerous. Wounded. But protected. She said it felt as though you had built an invisible wall around one particular memory. Every time someone came close to that memory, you changed the subject. Every time someone asked why you suddenly became distant, you gave them a simple answer. I'm tired. But you were not always tired. Sometimes you were remembering. And nobody knew. Not even the people who thought they knew you best. The psychic opened her eyes and looked directly at the person who hired her. Then she said, "You misunderstood this person." They asked, "What do you mean?" She replied, "You thought you were investigating someone who had something to hide." She paused. "You were actually investigating someone who had something to protect." Those words changed the entire atmosphere in the room. Because suddenly, the question was no longer, "What is this person hiding?" The question became, "What happened to this person?" And that was when the psychic saw the first image. A younger version of you. Standing alone. Trying to appear stronger than you actually felt. There were people around you. People you trusted. People whose words mattered to you. But one of them made a choice that changed everything. They betrayed your trust. And you never looked at them the same way again. Archangel Michael speaks now. I am Michael, and I stand where fear tries to enter. I saw the moment your heart learned that not every smile is sincere. I saw the moment you stopped explaining yourself. I saw the night when you asked yourself why people could hurt you and then behave as though nothing had happened. You wanted an answer. You never received one. So you created your own. You decided you must have been too trusting. Too emotional. Too available. Too forgiving. But I tell you this now. Your ability to love was never your weakness. The wrong people simply learned how to use it against you. And the psychic saw this. She said your story carried an unusual pattern. Whenever someone hurt you, you blamed yourself first. Whenever someone disappeared, you wondered what you had done. Whenever someone changed toward you, you searched your own behavior for the reason. You carried responsibility for things that were never yours. That was the secret. Not a dark secret. A painful one. You had been carrying guilt that belonged to somebody else. And the people who hired the psychic had no idea how close they were to discovering it. Because they were not expecting to hear that you were innocent. They were expecting confirmation of their suspicion. They wanted evidence. They wanted something they could use. They wanted a reason to feel superior to you. But instead, the psychic began describing something that made them uncomfortable. She said, "This person has been watched before." Nobody spoke. She continued. "Someone has been paying attention to their life from a distance. Your name had been discussed. Your choices had been discussed. Your relationships had been discussed. Even your silence had been discussed. Someone had been trying to understand why you walked away without fighting. Why you stopped chasing. Why you stopped explaining. Why you became impossible to manipulate. And the answer was simpler than they imagined. You had already learned the lesson they were still trying to teach you. You learned that peace can be more valuable than being understood. You learned that closure does not always come from another person. Sometimes closure comes from finally accepting that the explanation you wanted may never arrive. But there was something else. Something the psychic could not explain. She said she felt another presence around the story. Not a person. Not someone standing in the room. Something protective. Something that appeared whenever fear became overwhelming. She described a powerful figure standing behind you. A warrior. A guardian. A presence carrying a sword. The people in the room became silent. Because she said, "Someone has been protecting this person for longer than they realize. I am Michael. And if you have ever wondered why certain situations collapsed before they could destroy you, listen carefully. There were doors you wanted desperately to enter that closed at the last moment. You called it rejection. You called it bad timing. You called it another disappointment. But some doors closed because what was behind them would have cost you something you could not afford to lose. There were people you begged life to keep. They left. You thought you were being punished. You were being redirected. There were plans that fell apart when everything seemed perfect. You thought your life was falling apart. You could not see what was being removed from your path. And there were moments when you felt completely alone. Yet somehow, you survived them. That survival was not an accident. The psychic felt that. She said your story carried an unusual pattern. Loss followed by protection. Rejection followed by revelation. Silence followed by truth. Every time something disappeared from your life, something hidden eventually became visible. And then she said something that made the person who hired her stand up. She said, "The secret is not about what they did. It is about what was done to them." That sentence changed everything. Because someone in that room already knew. Someone knew exactly what had happened. Someone had been carrying a secret of their own. And suddenly they realized the psychic was getting too close. They tried to stop the session. They told her they had heard enough. But she refused. She said, "No, I have already seen it. You cannot ask me to look and then tell me to forget." The room became silent. Then she revealed something nobody expected. She said the person they were investigating had once been given a choice. A choice between revenge and peace. And you chose peace. That decision cost you. It cost you relationships. It cost you opportunities. It cost you the satisfaction of proving yourself right. But it protected something inside you that you did not even realize was still alive. Your heart. The part of you that still believed love could be real. The part of you that still believed people could change. The part of you that still wanted to forgive. You thought forgiveness meant forgetting. It did not. Forgiveness meant you stopped allowing the wound to control your future. And there is something I want you to do right now. Do not type a long comment. Do not explain your story. Just write one word. Protected. Not because you need to prove anything. But because there is power in acknowledging what you survived. And if you cannot write that word, write, I survived. Because somewhere inside you, there is a version of yourself who needs to hear those words. I survived. I am still here. I did not become cruel. I did not become what hurt me. I did not lose myself. And the psychic was not finished. She looked down at the table. Her voice became quieter. Then she said, there is one final thing. Everyone leaned forward. She took a long breath. And she revealed that the darkest secret connected to you was not something you had done. It was something you had been protecting from the world. And when she finally spoke the words, the person who hired her realized they had been asking the wrong question from the beginning. Because the truth was much bigger than a secret. It was a hidden connection. A connection that could explain why one person from your past has never truly been able to forget you. And what the psychic saw next, was the part that nobody in that room was prepared to hear. Do not leave yet. Because the next part is where the entire story turns. The psychic remained completely still. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then she opened her eyes and looked at the person who had hired her. Her expression had changed. There was no excitement in her face now. No curiosity. Only concern. She whispered, there is someone connected to this person who never got the ending they wanted. Nobody moved. The person across the table asked, who? The psychic shook her head. I don't know the name. Then what do you know? She stared toward the empty chair beside her. I know this person walked away believing they had lost you. A silence filled the room. And somewhere inside that silence was the beginning of a truth that had been buried for years. I am Jesus. And I want you to understand something before this revelation continues. Not every person who leaves your life has forgotten you. Some people leave because they cannot handle what your presence reveals about themselves. Your presence can expose what someone has been avoiding. It can reveal whether their intentions are pure. It can show them the difference between convenience and genuine love. And when a person realizes they cannot control you anymore, they may choose distance. They may pretend they never cared. They may act as though you were insignificant. But pretending is not the same as forgetting. The psychic saw this immediately. She said, this person keeps returning to the memory. The person who hired her asked, how? She answered, not physically. In their mind. They remember conversations. They remember your voice. They remember something you said when you thought nobody would remember. And that sentence struck something deep. Because you have probably experienced this before. You said something casually. You forgot about it. Years passed. Yet somebody else carried those words with them. You never knew. You never saw what your presence did to another person's life. Sometimes the person who feels forgotten is actually the person who left the deepest mark. The psychic described a memory. Two people standing somewhere private. One of them was hurt. The other was trying to hide it. There had been a conversation. A difficult one. You were not asking for much. You were asking for honesty. That was all. But honesty became uncomfortable. So instead of answering you, that person avoided the truth. They changed the subject. They became distant. And eventually, they disappeared. You were left wondering what had happened. You replayed every conversation. You searched for the moment when everything changed. You wondered whether you had said too much. Whether you had expected too much. Whether you had loved too deeply. But the psychic saw something different. She said, they were afraid of what would happen if they told the truth. The room became colder. Someone asked, "What truth?" The psychic closed her eyes. And then she described a feeling. Regret. Deep regret. Not yours. Theirs. I am Jesus. And I want you to hear this clearly. You were not abandoned because you were unworthy. You were abandoned because someone did not have the courage to face what they felt. There is a difference. One destroys your confidence. The other restores your understanding. For years, you may have interpreted somebody's inability to love you properly as proof that you were difficult to love. That interpretation was wrong. You were asking someone for something they were not emotionally prepared to give. You wanted consistency. They offered confusion. You wanted clarity. They offered mixed signals. You wanted truth. They offered silence. You wanted a future. They were still fighting their past. And you kept asking yourself, what was wrong with me? Nothing. That is the part you were never supposed to discover too early. Because if you had known the truth then, you might have walked away sooner. You might have stopped blaming yourself. You might have stopped waiting. And someone wanted you to keep waiting. Not necessarily because they wanted to hurt you. Sometimes people keep others waiting because they are afraid to make a decision. But indecision can still cause damage. The psychic suddenly opened her eyes. She said, "There is another person." Everyone looked at her. Someone else? Yes. Who? She looked toward the table. This person was involved in what happened. The atmosphere changed immediately. Because now the story was no longer about two people. There had been a third influence. Someone who knew more than they admitted. Someone who may have encouraged distance. Someone who may have said something that changed another person's perception of you. And this is where the story becomes uncomfortable. Because the psychic saw words. Not exact sentences. But the energy of words spoken behind your back. Someone had been told a version of your story that was not completely true. A version designed to make you look unstable. Too emotional. Too demanding. Too complicated. Too difficult. And the person listening believed it. At least for a while. That was the manipulation. Not a dramatic lie. Something much more dangerous. A half-truth. A carefully selected detail. A story where your reaction was shown but the reason for your reaction was hidden. You were made to look like the problem without anyone mentioning what happened before you reacted. The psychic whispered, "They judged the wound without seeing the weapon." That sentence silenced everyone. Because that was exactly what had happened. People saw your reaction. They did not see what caused it. They saw you become distant. They did not see how many times you had tried to communicate. They saw you stop trusting. They did not see how often your trust had been broken. They saw you become guarded. They never asked why. I am Jesus. And there is a reason I am bringing this to your attention. You have spent enough time defending yourself in rooms where people had already decided who you were. You do not need to convince everyone. You do not need to correct every rumor. You do not need to chase every person who misunderstood you. Truth has a way of surviving without your constant protection. And sometimes the greatest victory is allowing someone to discover the truth after you have already moved on. The psychic said the person connected to your past had recently experienced something that reminded them of you. A song. A place. A familiar phrase. A date. Something ordinary. Yet it opened a memory they had buried. And suddenly, they remembered everything. Not just the ending. The beginning. They remembered how safe they felt around you. They remembered how easily you made them laugh. They remembered the moments when they did not have to pretend. They remembered the version of themselves they became when they were with you. And that was what hurt the most. Because losing you was not the only thing they lost. They lost access to a version of themselves that existed when you were present. The psychic said, they miss who they were with this person. Nobody expected that. Because people often think they miss someone's face. Their voice. Their messages. Their presence. But sometimes what you really miss is who you became around them. And this person knew it. They had tried to replace the feeling. They tried distraction. They tried new connections. They tried pretending everything was fine. But certain memories do not disappear simply because someone refuses to discuss them. They wait. And eventually, something triggers them. A smell. A song. A quiet night. A familiar street. And suddenly the past becomes present again. The psychic leaned forward. Then she said something even stranger. They still wonder whether this person knows. The person who hired her asked, knows what? She looked directly at them. That they were not the villain in the story. Nobody spoke. Because there it was. The secret behind the secret. Someone had allowed you to believe that you were responsible for an ending that you did not cause. Someone had allowed you to carry guilt. And the person connected to you knew more than they admitted. They knew you had been treated unfairly. They knew the story was incomplete. They knew you had reasons for becoming distant. But they remained silent. And silence can become its own form of betrayal. I am Michael. I want you to remember the nights when you questioned yourself. The nights when you stared at your phone and wondered whether you should send another message. The moments when you almost reached out. Then stopped. The days when you convinced yourself you were finally over it. Then one memory brought everything back. You thought healing meant never thinking about it again. That is not healing. Healing is remembering without allowing the memory to decide your worth. You can remember someone and still move forward. You can love someone and still refuse to return. You can forgive someone and still keep the door closed. Those things can exist together. And there is another reason you must stay until the end. Because the psychic discovered something that changed the meaning of the entire investigation. She said, the person who hired me is not the only one who wanted answers. Everyone looked confused. She continued. The person you are investigating has been asking questions too. The room became completely silent. The psychic explained that your life had been observed from a distance. Someone wanted to know whether you had moved on. Whether you were happy. Whether you had found someone else. Whether you still remembered. But they were too afraid to ask directly. So they watched. Quietly. From far away. And this is where many people make a mistake. They assume that watching means love. It does not always. Sometimes watching means regret. Sometimes it means curiosity. Sometimes it means someone has not accepted the consequences of their own decisions. And sometimes it means a person is finally beginning to understand what they lost. The psychic said the strongest emotion around this person was not desire. It was remorse. They wished they had handled one moment differently. One conversation. One decision. One night. If they could return to that moment, they would say something different. But time does not move backward. So they live with the question, what would have happened if I had been honest? That question has followed them. And now it is following you too. Because there is something about your story that has not been revealed yet. The psychic suddenly stopped speaking. She placed her hands flat on the table. Then she said, I see a locked door. Someone asked, what is behind it? She answered, the truth. Whose truth? She looked toward the person who hired her. Yours. That was the moment everything changed. Because the psychic was no longer describing you. She was describing the people who had come looking for your secret. They had expected to discover something that would make you look guilty. Instead, the session was turning into a mirror. And the mirror was showing them their own choices. Their own jealousy. Their own assumptions. Their own fear. The person who hired the psychic began asking her to stop. But she continued. She said, you were not looking for their darkest secret. You were looking for permission to believe the worst about them. Silence. Then she added, and you did not get it. That sentence destroyed the purpose of the entire session. Because the truth could no longer be controlled. The investigation had failed. But the revelation had only begun. The psychic said there was one final memory buried beneath everything else. A memory connected to a promise. A promise you made to yourself. A promise nobody heard. A promise that changed the course of your life. And when that promise was finally revealed, it would explain why you walked away. Why you stopped chasing. Why you became stronger. And why someone from your past still cannot understand how you survived without them. The psychic closed her eyes one more time. And this time, she began to cry. Not because she was afraid of what she saw. Because she finally understood why you had been protected. And what she saw behind that locked door was the truth they had been trying to discover all along. The psychic closed her eyes. For a few seconds, nobody in the room could hear anything except her breathing. Then she whispered, I see a promise. The person sitting across from her leaned forward. What promise? The psychic did not answer immediately. She looked as though she was trying to understand what she was seeing. Then she said, this person promised themselves they would never beg again. Silence. They promised themselves they would never chase someone who had already decided to leave. Another pause. They promised themselves they would never explain their worth to someone who refused to see it. And suddenly, the entire story began making sense. Because that promise was not born from pride. It was born from pain. There had been a moment when you realized that no matter how clearly you explained yourself, someone had already made up their mind. So you stopped. You stopped defending yourself. You stopped sending paragraphs. You stopped asking why. You stopped trying to convince someone to stay. And people misunderstood that decision. They thought you had become cold. They thought you no longer cared. They thought you had moved on easily. But the truth was completely different. You cared so deeply that you had to choose yourself before you disappeared inside someone else's uncertainty. I am Jesus. There is a difference between giving up on someone and refusing to abandon yourself. You were not giving up. You were finally setting a boundary. You were saying, I can love you without destroying myself for you. That was the promise. And it changed everything. The psychic said she could see the exact moment you made it. You were alone. Nobody was there. There was no dramatic goodbye. No audience. No speech. Just you. Trying to hold yourself together. You had reached a point where you knew one more disappointment might break something inside you. So you made a decision. You would stop chasing. You would stop explaining. You would stop asking people to choose you. If someone wanted to be in your life, they would have to show it. Not through words. Through actions. And that decision became the beginning of your transformation. The psychic suddenly looked frightened. She said, "But there is something they don't know." The person who hired her asked, "What?" She replied, "The person who walked away did not know about this promise. They thought the silence meant rejection." That was the twist. The person connected to you saw your silence and interpreted it as indifference. They did not know you were hurting. They did not know you were waiting for them to show some effort. They did not know you were protecting your dignity. They thought you had stopped caring. And instead of asking you, they accepted the story someone else had given them. That was the moment everything collapsed. Two people were waiting. Two people were afraid. Two people believed the other had moved on. And nobody had the courage to break the silence. I am Michael. There are moments when pride disguises itself as protection. There are moments when fear disguises itself as logic. And there are moments when silence becomes so powerful that two people can lose years without ever saying what they truly feel. You were not the only one who was afraid. The other person was afraid too. But fear does not make decisions for us. We allow it to. They allowed fear to convince them that you did not care. You allowed pain to convince you that they had chosen someone else. And somewhere between those two beliefs stood a third person who benefited from the confusion. That is why this story lasted so long. Because everyone had only part of the truth. The psychic said, "I see a person who knew both sides. Someone who had information from you. Someone who had information from them. Someone who could have brought clarity. But they did not. Instead, they allowed both people to remain confused. And there was a reason. The psychic could feel jealousy. Not necessarily because this person wanted you. But because they wanted control. They did not want to lose their position. They did not want two people becoming close enough to question their influence. They knew that once the truth came out, their role would be exposed. So they continued feeding the misunderstanding. One comment here. One warning there. One carefully chosen sentence. Nothing dramatic enough to be questioned. But enough to create distance. And it worked. For years. The person connected to you eventually accepted the idea that you had chosen another path. They told themselves they had no reason to return. They convinced themselves that you had forgotten. They tried to move forward. But every time life became quiet, your memory returned. Because the heart remembers what the mind tries to dismiss. The psychic saw them looking at something. A photograph. An old message. Something they had saved without admitting why. They had never deleted it. Not because they were waiting. Because part of them could not bring themselves to erase the evidence that the connection had once been real. And then came the moment that changed everything. They discovered a piece of information. Something small. Something nobody thought mattered. But it contradicted what they had been told. They started asking questions. And suddenly, the person who had influenced the situation became nervous. Because one question leads to another. And another. And eventually, the entire story begins collapsing. The psychic said, "They are discovering that the timeline does not make sense." The room went silent. She continued. "They are realizing that the story they believed was incomplete." Then she said something even more powerful. "They are beginning to understand that this person was waiting for them." That realization was painful. Because it meant the separation may never have been inevitable. One conversation could have changed everything. One honest question. One decision to ignore outside voices. One moment of courage. But nobody took that step. And now the past cannot be rewritten. I am Jesus. You cannot return to yesterday. You cannot walk back into the moment where you were misunderstood and suddenly force everyone to see clearly. But you can stop carrying yesterday into tomorrow. That is what I want for you. Not revenge. Not obsession. Not waiting. Freedom. You have already spent enough time wondering what they are thinking. You have already spent enough time wondering whether they regret it. You have already spent enough time asking whether they still remember. Let them remember. Let them wonder. Let them discover the truth. Your responsibility is not to make them understand. Your responsibility is to understand yourself. And the psychic discovered something else about you. She said, "This person is much stronger than they realize." Why? Because you survived something that could have made you bitter. You survived rejection without becoming cruel. You survived betrayal without becoming dishonest. You survived disappointment without losing your ability to love. That is rare. Many people become exactly what hurt them. You did not. You became more careful. You became more observant. You became more selective. But you did not lose your heart. That is why the people who underestimated you will eventually be surprised. They thought your kindness meant weakness. They did not understand that kindness can coexist with boundaries. They thought your patience meant you would tolerate anything. They did not understand that patience has a limit. They thought your silence meant you had nothing to say. They did not understand that silence can be the final form of self-respect. I am Michael. And I want you to remember the moment you stopped chasing. That was not the moment you lost them. That was the moment you found yourself. You may have cried afterward. You may have questioned your decision. You may have wanted to reach out again. But something inside you knew. If I go back without change, I will lose myself again. So you stayed away. And slowly, you changed. You became comfortable with your own company. You stopped needing constant reassurance. You stopped looking for hidden meanings in every message. You stopped believing that love had to be difficult to be real. You learned that peace is not boring. Peace is what healthy love feels like. And that lesson prepared you for something the psychic saw next. She saw another chapter. Not necessarily a person. A possibility. A life where you are not constantly questioning where you stand. A relationship where communication is direct. Where affection is consistent. Where you do not have to compete with someone's confusion. Where you are not punished for asking for honesty. But before that chapter can fully begin, something from the past has to be understood. The truth. And that truth was getting closer. The psychic said the person from your past was finally asking someone directly, "Did you tell me the truth about them?" The answer was not immediate. That hesitation said everything. Because sometimes the truth is revealed before the confession. A pause. A change in expression. A refusal to answer. A sudden attempt to change the subject. The person asking the question noticed. And they knew. They knew something had been hidden. The psychic said, "They are angry. Not with you. With themselves. Because they finally understood that they had allowed someone else to influence their decision. They had trusted another voice more than their own experience with you. And now they were forced to face the consequences. They could no longer blame you. They could no longer say, they didn't care. Because the evidence did not support that story. They could no longer say, they moved on. Because your behavior had never actually proven it. They could no longer pretend the separation was simple. It was complicated. And they had been part of the reason. That realization can be painful. Because regret is not always about losing someone. Sometimes regret is realizing that you lost something because you were too afraid to protect it. I am Jesus. If someone from your past eventually realizes this, let them. But do not build your future around their realization. You do not need to wait for a confession. You do not need to wait for an apology. You do not need to wait for someone to finally say, I understand now. Your healing cannot be placed in someone else's hands. Take it back. Your peace belongs to you. Your future belongs to you. Your identity belongs to you. And the psychic's final vision of the night was about that. She saw you standing somewhere alone. But this time, you were smiling. Not the forced smile you used to show people when you were hurting. A real smile. The kind that appears when someone finally stops fighting the past. She said, "They are not waiting anymore." And that was the moment everyone understood. The investigation had started because someone wanted to discover your darkest secret. But the truth was much more beautiful. Your darkest secret was simply this: you had been pretending you were okay long after you stopped being okay. You hid how deeply the betrayal affected you. You hid how much you wanted someone to choose you. You hid how badly you wanted an explanation. You hid your fear that perhaps you were not enough. And eventually, you became so good at hiding your pain that people believed you had never been hurt. But you were. You just healed quietly. And now the people who once misunderstood your silence may finally understand what it meant. It meant, I am hurting. It meant, I cannot keep doing this. It meant, I still care, but I have to protect myself. And eventually, it meant, I choose peace. I am Michael. If you are listening to this and you recognize yourself in these words, remember something. You do not have to return to the place where you learned your hardest lesson. You can carry the wisdom without carrying the wound. You can remember without reopening. You can forgive without forgetting. You can love without chasing. You can care without abandoning yourself. And if someone eventually comes back, you do not have to decide immediately. Watch. Listen. Observe. Let their actions speak. Because you have already learned what happens when words are allowed to replace truth. Never again. The next chapter of your life must be built differently. No more guessing. No more chasing. No more proving. No more begging to be understood. No more accepting half-love because you are afraid of being alone. You have already survived loneliness. You know you can survive it. Now you deserve connection that does not make you feel lonely while someone is standing beside you. That is the difference. And that is why the story does not end with the person who left. It ends with you. Because the person who walked away thought they were leaving a broken heart behind. They did not realize they were leaving behind someone who would eventually become stronger than the version of you they knew. They did not realize that the silence they misunderstood would become your strength. They did not realize that the rejection they caused would become your boundary. They did not realize that the loss they created would become your transformation. And one day, they may understand. They may finally see everything clearly. They may finally realize that the person they believed was easy to forget, was the person they never truly forgot. But by then, something will have changed. You will no longer need that realization. And that is where the final revelation begins. Because the psychic still had one thing left to say. Something so unexpected that everyone in that room became completely silent. She looked at the person who hired her. Then she said, "You thought you were trying to discover their secret." She paused. But the secret was never theirs. It was yours. And what she revealed next changed everything. The psychic looked directly at the person who had hired her. Nobody spoke. The room felt different now. The questions they had brought into that room no longer seemed important. Because the psychic had turned the entire investigation around. She whispered, "You came here looking for their darkest secret." She paused. "But you were never supposed to find darkness. You were supposed to find the truth." The person sitting across from her asked, "What truth?" The psychic looked toward the empty chair. The truth about why they walked away. And suddenly, everything connected. The silence. The distance. The misunderstanding. The person from the past who never completely forgot. The third person who had influenced the situation. The promise you made to yourself. It was all connected. The psychic said, this person did not walk away because they stopped caring. They walked away because they finally understood that staying was destroying them. That sentence carried the weight of years. You had not left because your heart was empty. You left because your heart was exhausted. There is a difference. You had given explanations. You had given chances. You had given patience. You had waited for consistency. You had waited for honesty. You had waited for someone to meet you halfway. And eventually, you realized you were standing alone on a bridge that required two people to cross. So you stopped. Not because you did not love. Because you finally loved yourself enough to stop begging. I am Jesus. There are moments when walking away looks like defeat to the people who do not understand what happened before that moment. They see the ending. They do not see the 1,000 small disappointments that created it. They see you becoming distant. They do not see how many times you tried to stay close. They see your silence. They do not see all the words you said before becoming silent. They see the final decision. They do not see everything that led to it. That is why people can judge you so easily. They are looking at one page of a book and pretending they know the entire story. But I know the entire story. I saw every moment you swallowed your pain. I saw every time you wanted to say something and decided not to. I saw every night when you questioned yourself. I saw the moments when you blamed yourself for someone else's behavior. And I saw the moment something inside you finally changed. You stopped asking, how can I make them understand me? And you started asking, how can I protect my peace? That question saved you. The psychic suddenly became emotional. She said, there is another revelation. The person across from her looked nervous. What is it? She answered, the person who lied about them knows that the truth is coming out. Silence. That person had sensed the situation changing. They knew questions were being asked. They knew the story was no longer holding together. They knew the person they had influenced was remembering details. And they were afraid. Because once the truth is discovered, manipulation loses its power. You can control what someone believes for a while. You cannot control what they discover forever. The psychic said, I see a confrontation. Not a violent confrontation. A conversation. A difficult one. Someone asking, why did you tell me that? And the answer was weak. Excuses. Half explanations. Attempts to shift blame. But the person asking questions had already seen enough. They knew. The story they had believed for years was incomplete. And then came the question that hurt the most. Did you ever ask them? The answer was no. They had never asked you directly. They had trusted someone else's version. That realization was devastating. Because it meant the separation could have been avoided. One conversation might have changed everything. One honest question. One moment of courage. One decision to stop listening to everyone else. But that moment never came. And now the past could not be rewritten. I am Michael. You must understand something. Not every regret means someone should return. Sometimes regret is simply the consequence of a lesson. The person from your past may regret what happened. They may wish they had handled things differently. They may wonder where you are now. They may even wonder whether you would forgive them. But none of that means you must reopen the door. You are allowed to move forward. You are allowed to have peace. You are allowed to say, that chapter mattered, but it is over. And that is exactly what the psychic saw happening. She saw you becoming emotionally free. Not because you forgot. Because you understood. You understood why you had to leave. You understood why the situation could not continue. You understood why your heart needed distance. And most importantly, you understood that your worth had never been decided by another person's ability to recognize it. That realization changed you. You became quieter. But not weaker. You became selective. But not heartless. You became independent. But not incapable of love. You became careful. But not bitter. That is what surviving betrayal is supposed to look like. You do not become someone who trusts nobody. You become someone who knows where trust belongs. I am Jesus. There is something I want you to release tonight. Release the need to know whether they regret losing you. Release the need to know whether they still think about you. Release the need to know whether they will come back. Because your life cannot remain paused while someone else decides what they want. If they return, you will decide what happens next. If they do not, you will still move forward. Your future is not waiting for another person's permission. And the moment you understand that, you become free. The psychic looked at the empty chair again. Then she smiled. She said, "This person is entering a completely different chapter." The person who hired her asked, "With whom?" The psychic shook her head. "That is not what matters." "What matters?" She answered, "They are finally entering a chapter where they do not have to prove their worth." That was the real future. Not necessarily a reunion. Not necessarily a new relationship. A new version of you. A version that no longer confuses attention with love. A version that no longer confuses chemistry with safety. A version that no longer mistakes inconsistency for mystery. A version that knows peace is not boring. Peace is what healthy love feels like. And if someone comes into your life after this transformation, they will meet someone completely different. They will meet someone who communicates directly. Someone who watches actions. Someone who respects boundaries. Someone who does not chase. Someone who can walk away. Someone who knows that being alone is better than being emotionally abandoned while standing beside another person. That is what your past taught you. And that lesson was expensive. But it was not wasted. I am Michael. Think about everything you once believed you could not survive. The night you thought you would never feel normal again. The day you realized someone you trusted had disappointed you. The moment you accepted that a relationship might never become what you hoped. The silence after the final conversation. The days when you pretended you were okay. You survived every one of them. And every time you survived something you thought would destroy you, you became a little harder to manipulate. That is why you are different now. You still have a soft heart. But you have stronger boundaries around it. You still believe in love. But you no longer believe love requires suffering. You still forgive. But you no longer confuse forgiveness with permission. You still care. But you no longer abandon yourself to prove it. That is growth. And that is why the psychic could not find the darkness they were expecting. Because the secret was not that you were dangerous. The secret was that you were wounded. And wounded people can become powerful when they choose healing instead of revenge. You chose healing. That is why your story shocked everyone. They expected the psychic to expose you. Instead, she exposed the people who misunderstood you. She exposed the lie. She exposed the manipulation. She exposed the regret. And most importantly, she exposed the version of yourself you had been hiding. The version that was stronger than anyone realized. I am Jesus. You do not need to prove this story to anyone. You do not need to make everyone believe you. You do not need to explain every detail. There are people who will misunderstand you no matter how carefully you speak. Let them. There are people who will believe rumors. Let them. There are people who will judge you based on one moment. Let them. Your truth does not become false because someone refuses to understand it. And your value does not decrease because someone failed to recognize it. You are still you. The same heart. The same soul. The same person who survived. And perhaps the most beautiful part is this. One day, you may look back at everything that happened and realize that the person you were desperately trying to hold onto was never the destination. They were part of the preparation. They taught you what inconsistency feels like. They taught you what betrayal feels like. They taught you what confusion feels like. They taught you what happens when you ignore your intuition. And because of that, you now know exactly what you will never accept again. Sometimes the lesson is painful because it is preparing you for something peaceful. The psychic's final vision showed a door. Behind the door was light. You were standing in front of it. You looked back once. Not with anger. Not with longing. With gratitude. Because you finally understood. That chapter did not destroy you. It introduced you to yourself. Then you turned around. And you walked forward. That was the moment the psychic stopped speaking. The session was over. But the person who had hired her remained sitting there. They had entered the room believing they were going to discover your darkest secret. Instead, they discovered something they could not control. Your truth. And your truth was simple. You loved genuinely. You were hurt deeply. You stayed longer than you should have. You tried harder than people knew. You were misunderstood. You were influenced by circumstances you could not control. And eventually, you chose yourself. That was the secret. Not darkness. Strength. Not revenge. Peace. Not hatred. Healing. Not weakness. Transformation. I am Michael. So if the past ever tries to pull you backward, remember this moment. Remember what it cost you to become who you are. Do not trade your peace for familiarity. Do not trade your growth for a temporary feeling. Do not return to confusion simply because loneliness made the past look beautiful. Remember the whole story. Not just the beautiful moments. Remember everything. And if someone from your past ever comes back, do not ask only, do they still love me? Ask, can I trust them? Ask, have they changed? Ask, can this connection exist without destroying my peace? Those questions will protect you. Because love can be real and still be unhealthy. Feelings can be genuine and still not be enough. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is walk away from something your heart still remembers. I am Jesus. Your story does not end with the person who misunderstood you. Your story continues with the person you became after they left. You are not the rejection. You are not the betrayal. You are not the rumor. You are not the mistake. You are not the silence. You are not the person someone else described. You are the person who survived all of it. And if nobody has told you this lately, I am telling you now. You did enough. You loved enough. You tried enough. You waited enough. You explained enough. You have nothing left to prove. Now live. Live without checking who is watching. Live without wondering who regrets losing you. Live without waiting for an apology. Live without needing the past to make sense before you allow yourself to be happy. Your peace does not need permission. And if this message reached something inside you that you have never been able to explain, do not tell your whole story in the comments. Just write 3 words, I choose peace. If you have survived something you thought would destroy you, write, I survived. Let those words be your declaration. Not for strangers. For yourself. Because there was once a version of you who thought the pain would last forever. There was once a version of you who thought you would never trust again. There was once a version of you who believed someone else's rejection meant you were not enough. Look at yourself now. You are still here. You are still breathing. You are still capable of love. You are still capable of hope. And you are finally beginning to understand your worth. That is the ending they never expected. The psychic was hired to expose your darkest secret. Instead, she discovered your greatest strength. You were never hiding something shameful. You were hiding how much pain you had survived. You were hiding how many nights you cried. You were hiding how badly you wanted to be understood. You were hiding how afraid you were that nobody would ever choose you. And yet, you kept going. You kept loving. You kept believing. You kept your heart alive. That is not darkness. That is courage. I am Michael. The battle is over. You do not have to keep fighting people who are no longer standing in front of you. You do not have to keep defending yourself against old accusations. You do not have to keep proving what happened. Let the truth stand on its own. Let time reveal what words could not. Let people discover what they were too blind to see. And you, keep walking. Because there is something ahead of you that is far more important than the person behind you. Your peace. Your future. Your purpose. Your life. And when you finally reach the place where you no longer need anyone from the past to understand what they lost, you will realize something extraordinary. They did not get the final word. Your pain did not get the final word. The betrayal did not get the final word. The lie did not get the final word. You did. And your final word is this: I choose peace. I choose myself. I keep moving forward. And that is why the darkest secret changed everything. Because the secret was never what you had done. It was what you had survived. And the person they thought would remain broken, became the person they could never break again.